All right, seeing that it's 6:30, I'd like to call this Thursday, September 16th, 2021 meeting of the Finance Committee to order. First on our agenda this evening is the approval of minutes. We have two sets of minutes that we're looking at. Has everyone had a chance to review both sets of minutes, the April minutes and the May minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Eric, have you?
Yes.
And then Dave, have you?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Do I have a motion? Pam, if you can remind me what the first set of minutes, the date for those?
April 8th.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yay.
Have a motion on the April 8th minutes, please?
I make a motion that we accept the minute meetings of April 8th as presented.
I second it.
Any discussion? All's in favor?
Aye.
Dane,
All right. That's 4,
one abstention.
and with 1 abstention. Thank you, Sam. And then do I have a motion on the May 27th meeting minutes?
I make a motion that we accept the minutes of May 27th as presented.
I second it.
Any discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any nays or abstentions?
Abstention.
And abstention for Sam. Thank you. Moving right along. We have a new set of members on the Finance Committee this year. We have 2 new members. One who's with us currently, it is Sam Chase. He should be no stranger to anyone who's paid attention to the town over the last few decades. To be fair.
Thank you.
And we welcome you, and we're thrilled to have you.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much, Jim.
I
Excellent.
second that.
Thank you, David.
It's a quorum on that.
And then our second member, I don't see him on here right now, but John Thibault has also joined our membership, and we're thrilled to have him. And again, we're always sad to see members go. We wish Vicki and Amina well in their endeavors, but we're always happy to have new members come on, even when they're returning to the Finance Committee. All right, moving right along, we need to appoint a member as a liaison to the Capital Planning Committee. John Souza, our fearless finance director, will be heading and chairing that committee again this year. Correct, John?
There we go. Sorry about that, Jim. Yes, that's correct. We'll be starting another capital planning season in November.
Okay. We expect about three nights for that.
3 is pretty typical. If needed, we could always schedule a 4th, or, if there's always a snow date. We don't want to mention snow, but just at that time of year, it's possible.
And then when do you typically meet?
It's usually, we changed it up a few years back. So it's typically Thursday evening, 7 p.m. If that time does not work for members, but that gives folks that work out of town a chance to, get home and come to the meeting, especially the citizen members. So we switched, years back, we met early Friday mornings, but we've moved away from that.
Okay. Do we have any members that are interested in doing the Capital Planning Committee this year? The last 2 years, it's been Amina. But since she's left us, there's an opening available.
I would volunteer. My background is in capital, both in terms of servicing industry and also producing capital projects. So it would be a good area for me.
All right. Unless someone else would like to throw their hat in as well, I think they would be an excellent selection for the Capital Planning Committee.
I think I really enjoyed it when I was on it. And I think it's a great learning experience about how the various departments work together. And John does an excellent job. So I think it'll be great for Dave to do it. Do you need a nomination? Oh, no, you can just name him.
No. It's yours. You'll be our liaison to the capital planning committee. Thank you for volunteering. All right. Next on our agenda is we're flowing right into the fiscal year 2021 budget report and certified free cash report. And with us this evening is Darlene Lucier, our town accountant.
Good
Hi,
evening.
Darlene.
Hi, good evening, everybody.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good to see everybody. Okay, I'm going to try and put up the PowerPoint. I'm going to share it. I think I can do this.
If not, I can put it up for you.
Yep, I have it here. So let me see if I can just share my screen. I think if I do this and click OK. And do you see it? No? Yes?
Nope.
Not yet. Okay. Let's see. It's always technical. Let's see. Share screen. Oh, host disabled. Okay. Maybe now. Let's see.
You should have the option now, Darlene.
Okay. Share screen. Oh, there we go. Perfect. How's that?
Yep.
Perfect. And I will put it from the beginning. Okay, yeah, I'll see that. Perfect. Okay.
Darling, before you get started,
Yeah,
would you prefer questions as you go in your presentation or at the end?
we can do it as we go because I'll kind of stop. I'll start with I'm going to give the good news about what the number was for free cash, but then I'm going to go into revenues and then expenditures. So it would be great if you want to ask as we go along. That'd be good.
Okay, thanks.
So I'm going to come back to revenues, but let's go right to the certification of free cash. Great news story. We did a great number for free cash this year. 5,670,686 were certified from my balance sheets I submitted to the DOR a few weeks ago. This is the largest free cash number I've ever had certified as a town accountant. And I think probably one of the largest I've seen since I've been with the town for the last 20 years. So, but this was, it was great to see this. I will kind of go into a little bit more of detail why I think we had such a larger free cash this year, but it's great to see that number. We're seeing a lot of communities having their free cash numbers being certified as larger than past years they've seen. So we'll kind of go back to the revenues so that we can kind of see where that number kind of came from. But the local receipts is the big area of where our free cash kind of came from. So on the local receipts, total local receipts budgeted was $8.9 million, but we received $12.8 million. So there's like $3.8 million right there of that $5 million we got certified for free cash. Let's talk about those areas of where we did well in. Motor vehicle. The budget for 21, both on revenues and expenditures, was conservative budgeting. I don't get involved in the budgeting. That's John and the town managers and the finance directors, but they were kind of following what the DOR was suggesting to everyone to, 21 should, because it was a pandemic year, everybody should be cautious of their budgets and to budget conservatively. So we did. So we had a $4.9 million budget for motor vehicle. And surprisingly, we ended up getting $5.3 million, which is 10% over the budget and pretty much the same as prior year. But we were really surprised to see, I think people are still leasing vehicles. I think some had some money this year, maybe a little extra money they were getting from the COVID relief funds that were coming in to folks. Maybe they just decided they were going to go ahead and spend a little bit of that on the motor vehicles. I'm not sure what we're going to see for next year. It's hard to get vehicles now, people are saying, so we'll see what that number is going to be next year. But we fared well there. The big area was our permitting fee. We budgeted $75,000, but we received $3 million worth of revenue. So there's a $2 million surplus there, and that one of it, big piece of it was the $1 million permitting fee that we received from Thermo Fisher Scientific. So of course, we're not going to see that again. This is kind of an anomaly. We don't see this again, but this really did help us in our bottom line for local receipts. Right there was $1 million. But in overall, we actually were $2 million over the budget. And I think we're seeing people are still investing in their homes. A lot of the building permits that are being pulled are for construction on people's homes, whether they're, just doing renovations is really what it is. And I think it's because people are still staying home and seeing that that's where they're going to invest their money in. Surprisingly, we did we were over budget again received more on the meals tax. People must have decided, okay, let's go to dinner. I'm sick of staying home. I'll wear my mask and then in hope that I can be safe when I go out to dinner, because we had a $325,000 budget, but we received almost $6 million worth of revenue for that. So we did really well there. Rooms tax, we came in over budget there. We were under from we were prior year, about a 15% less than prior year. But again, we were 40% over than what was the actual budgeted amount. Other areas that we did well with is a miscellaneous recurring revenue. A lot of that a big piece of it was our SRECs, our solar. We actually ended up selling some back solar credits to the grids. So that brought in some revenue for us. And then again, property tax, it always comes in strong at about, we always around the 98.9 or almost 99%. So we really did well there. So overall, we fared extremely well on revenues. A lot of that $5 million monies for free cash really came from this whole revenue piece. Any questions on revenues? I just had other little, just to just kind of mention it, other little areas that were strong were in fees and things like that. And the areas that we were seeing strong, I just kind of think that it's kind of good to mention was under Board of Health. Down say right here. So it's like the town clerks area, Board of Health, police, outside detail fees, those type of things really did help with that line item also. So we fared well in the fees in other department revenues. The fees, again, we were over budgeted by about 40% on the fees lines too.
One of my questions was about the room tax. What is happening with the Radisson? I mean, is that hotel offline, or will we get fees from them next year? I don't know what's happening with the Radisson.
Kathy, it's Paul Cohen, town manager. The Radisson remains closed. They have not pulled a building permit, nor are there any plans that we're aware of to rehabilitate or reopen that facility. So no, we're not receiving any revenue from that site. And I think part of the reason that the rooms revenue came in above the budget was the fact that with the Commonwealth is housing some homeless people in the Best Western and at the Holiday Inn Express. And as part of that arrangement, they do pay the tax to the local community.
Thanks.
Just a question, Darlene, on I guess two questions on the permitting. So the Thermo Fisher was, half of the overage. Was the other $1 million positive variance just spread amongst a whole bunch? Like there wasn't any really big drivers in there?
No, they were really just spread among the, there really wasn't anything that was big that really stood out. We don't really have any big projects, we know that Princeton Street, they haven't pulled anything yet or anything there. So there hasn't been any big projects, or they're really just kind of the home building.
Okay, thanks. And then on the second one, which I think Paul kind of half answered this halfway, but on the local, like on the meal in the hotel or the room tax, was there a noticeable increase like in the second half of the year? I'm thinking of people getting vaccinated and are going back out, or was it just, again, kind of higher across the board throughout the entire year?
Yeah, John, our finance director, he kind of gives us a quarterly report on those, and it was kind of just steady actually across the board. Really didn't see one spike up higher than the other. It was pretty like straight across the board.
All right, thank you.
Mhm. Okay, these were just, again, this is just kind of the report that I do that shows you the actuals to budgeted. And then on the expenditure side for 21, we had some turnbacks to the town for unexpended expenditures for departments, which is almost $1 million, about $919,000 of turnbacks. Unencumbered funds, which were things that were purchased prior to June 30th, but the invoices hadn't come in, was 1.7. The school department, the bulk of that number is from the school department, which was $1.4 million. They're allowed to encumber all of their funds. Unlike the town, we cannot encumber any salaries, but the school can. It's their autonomy. They have one number. They can kind of use their whole budget, encumber, and do some prepays for special ed and things like that. So they encumbered everything that they had left over in their budget for the 1.4 million. The other departments, you'll see there was just a small amount under public safety. We had some public works stuff, some work that was being done under the municipal facilities, all her Kathleen's projects. So you'll just see those are just some of the things that we encumbered. But what was nice to see is that we did have, people did have some turnbacks on their budget. That would help, that also helps with free cash. This is just the other part of my report on state assessments and any warrant articles that we had at spring and fall town meeting in fiscal 21. And this, but other than that, everything is going well. We're just, the auditors were here. I think today was their last day. So happy to report that that I think everything went well. They're pretty poker faced, so they don't say too much, and we'll see what their report comes out with, but I think we did well. They spent a lot of time with me. They spent a lot of time going through our COVID grants, the FEMA, the one that we got, COVID relief grant through FEMA, the COVID relief grant that we got from the state, and now the ARPA grant. They really spent a lot of time, a lot of testing, not only just invoices, but journal entries, just a lot of work on those. So I know they're going to be, though these are going to be something they're going to be spending probably the next few years on. And I know with John, they've been spending a lot of time with his debt and refundings, all the refunding debts that we've had. So they've been kind of keeping us hopping all week. Do I have any other questions? Anyone? Just other little, like the trust funds. I know people always like to know what our trust balances were. The stabilization fund at the end of the fiscal 21 was 10,887,860. We had investment earnings there of about $433,000. So we just well there. We have that the affordable housing stabilization fund end of the year of $620,000 in it. Those are just the transfers that we get, that you transfer in from any housing money that comes in for affordable housing. And the OPEB obligation, we just did have a audit done on that. But the balance in that account now is 17,256,18. We did have great earnings and investments on there of $3.6 million for the year. We are now 25% funded in that account, which I think is great. And I hope we continue to keep funding that account and growing that funded amount. I think it's probably the right thing to do, but that's kind of the end of my presentation. If anybody has any questions.
On the OPEB you just mentioned, so it's 17 and change, and we made 3 million. So I'm assuming that means before the year started, it was at 14.
11. Yep, 11,958,677 was the balance at the as of July 1st.
That's a pretty hefty return. What's driving that return?
I would throw this to John, seeing that he is our financial advisor and he knows what they invest in.
Yes, so Eric, to answer your question, all of our OPEB assets are invested with the Commonwealth's Pension Reserves Investment Trust, or it's also called the PRIM Board. They manage the state teachers' retirement funds and other funds, and we have a separate account with them. We moved the assets there several years ago, but it's in a broad variety of assets. They're heavily into domestic stocks, global stocks. They're into some things that's like forestry. It's a really well diversified fund, but because of the strong performance of the stock market this year, that fund had a great return. I've actually, in all the years since we've been there, we've never had a return that strong. So, the stock market's had a good run. I'm not sure, if not to be negative, but we're seeing some signs of inflation. My concerns will be if interest rates start to tick up, that could kind of dampen returns. But as long as it keeps rolling, we've been very pleased with the performance. So
I assume the stabilization fund is sitting in like cash, T-bills, and money market. We made like 4% on that.
Right, you're exactly right. So our general stabilization is actually, there are two companies that assist me with the investments on that. That's a much more conservative profile, and the reason is that stabilization is considered a trust fund under Mass General Law. So we're only permitted to go up to a certain point. So off the top of my head, it's about 85% fixed income investments, about roughly 5% or less in cash, and the rest and there's a small amount in stocks that we're allowed to invest in Massachusetts. But the OPEB fund, state law allows that to be invested in a more aggressive way. You can have more stocks, more equities, and again, it's not, we're not in anything really risky or anything, but it's a much more, you're allowed to pick some we don't pick them. It's actually the Commonwealth, the PRIM board, but we're allowed to invest a much more aggressive profile, if you will, for the longer term gains.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, seeing none. Thank you, Darlene.
Alrighty, thank you. No problem.
All right. Next on our agenda this evening, we have a review and discussion of the warrant article for the 2021 Fall Annual Town Meeting and a review of the financial plan. With us this evening, we have Paul Cohen, our Town Manager, and John Souza, our Finance Director and Treasurer. Good evening.
Good evening. Good evening, members of the Finance Committee. You see in the warrant that we sent to you, the 30 articles for the Fall Annual Town Meeting. We expect that 17 of those 30 will be taken on a consent agenda because of their nature. The first 10 are traditional financial articles and some of the recapture that Darlene spoke of. And then there's a series of 7 zoning articles that Christina Papadopoulos is here to join us this evening and can cover. But before we get to Christina, and then John and I can fill in the back, I see we have our town clerk, Tricia Doris, and Board of Registrar member Jim Lane on the call this evening. John can control and put up the PowerPoint for their slides. Their articles start under Article 18, and they can quickly step you through the proposed charter amendments at this time. The one thing that's nice about this warrant is it's relatively straightforward and understandable, and I think you'll see that on these charter changes. Probably the one that's more complex are the zoning bylaw amendments regarding the stormwater thing, and Christina will take that under consolidated approach. So, John, if you could go to Article 18, I'll stop speaking and turn it over to the clerk and registrar.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having us here this evening. Jim Lane, Curtis Barton, and I are here to just clarify any questions you might have on these 4 articles. Starting with Article 18, this is just simply a clarifying language article. We're looking to amend the Charter Part 2, Section 2-3, subsection C, by just adding the word elected after the subheading candidates for re-election. There was a little bit of discrepancy and confusion regarding the definition of the word incumbent as it stands on its own, that the definition of the incumbent just is a holder of an office or post. So by reinforcing the subheading where it says candidates for re-election, we just wanted to punctuate that this elected incumbent town meeting reps may seek re-election with their current precincts by notifying the town clerk's office of their intent to do so by using the appropriate form supplied by the town clerk. And that just separates those that are appointed, temporarily appointed town meeting reps, that they're only temporarily appointed if a seat is vacated midterm and they're appointed by their fellow town meeting reps within that precinct until the next election. So we just wanted to add that clarifying language for Article 18. Would you prefer that I go through all of them, or do you want to, if there's questions in between, do you want me to pause in between?
Just before you proceed, John, are you able to turn off the guidance there for regarding subtitles? It's kind of blocking the language.
Yeah, let's see.
Or turn it on to make it go away. Either way.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
all right, and then we'll get rid of it.
There you go. Turn it on, turn it off. There we go.
I didn't realize you could
Sounds
see that.
good.
Okay. Is everything else displayed okay on the screen, or?
It is, and now we're actually getting a recording of everything we're saying.
I better be careful. All right, so you can see on this article that it's just got that simple one additional word added under subsection C with the word elected, which is underlined.
Any questions? I think that's pretty straightforward.
Okay, all right. Moving on to Article 19. Article 19 is, we wanted to cross out a section of the language that limits any filling of vacancies to in person. So what we're looking to do for Article 19 is we want to amend Part 2, Section 2-4 relative to elections and strike out language that's specific to meeting in person to fill a town meeting vacancy. And we'll add language that will allow for the vacancy to be filled by mail ballot or in person. So basically, it gets a little hectic prior to town meeting when you're trying to run multiple mini elections to fill these vacancies. And it worked really well during COVID, where we actually mailed ballots to all of the precinct reps with the names of the interested candidates and then a space for write-ins, and then they simply mailed them back. So by modifying the language in here and crossing out the words that say call all town meeting members of that precinct together at a convenient place, that's what limits us to in person. Removing that, adding the language notify elected town meeting members within the precinct of the vacancy, and then crossing out, that will clarify that any such tie shall be filled then and there, get rid of that, and then add the language that the tie will be broken by ballots cast by the elected town meeting members participating. And the purpose of that is, again, to allow for that mailed ballot to fill those temporary vacancies. Any questions on Article 19?
So Tricia, just one, before this change, it looks like it was time bound, that you had to call everybody together within 7 days. Now, what's the time limit for people to respond to the mail ballot?
The timeline, well, again, it's as long as it's done prior to town meeting starting. I mean, because we notify them within 7 days, but then we would actually fill it at town meeting. So I don't know that the 7 days before the town meeting was ever, we notified them, but we actually met at town meeting before it started to fill the vacancies.
It happened a few times at the pre-town meeting as well.
Yeah, that's true.
So it wouldn't be in practice, it wasn't really being done 7 days after the election. Again, as you said, Tricia, people were being notified. This happened in my precinct a few times where we get notified and then we plan to meet a little earlier on the night of the pre-town meeting and cast a vote. And sometimes there'd be issues that we could have a quorum and
yeah, and that's the thing, you don't even need a quorum. If one precinct rep shows up, that one person gets to decide. And that's the beauty of being able to mail everybody a ballot, that you get a far better response that way. So it just saves a lot of headaches, and it went really smoothly. And I just think it's a practice that we should be able to have the option to continue.
Great, thank you.
Okay. There's no other questions on Article 19. Article 20, this is the one where the last Charter Review Committee, my predecessor had asked that there was a minimum number of write-in votes required in order to fill a vacancy for town meeting. So as you know, town meeting is a very important role, and anybody who wants to run for town meeting member has to take out papers and get a minimum of 25 signatures. We usually ask for 20 to 30% more than that. And then they submit their nomination papers. Sometimes if there's a vacancy and we don't get enough candidates pulling papers for that position, then write-ins come into play. So prior to the last charter review, there was a minimum of 5 votes needed for a write-in vote to be able to qualify. My predecessor had asked that number to be increased to 10. During the review process, a question evidently came up as to why there was a minimum at all. And rather than calling the clerk back in to explain the answer, it was removed. So the challenge that presents to us in our office, and not only that, but also just to the moving the election forward, is that you have to keep all of the reserves now. So you don't have a minimum number of votes in order to keep in a reserve. So every single solitary single vote has to be researched as to what their contact information is. It has to be kept in reserve, but also all of those single votes equals a failure to elect because they're a tie. So it just is a challenging administrative task. How you decide who moves up next in line, many situations, the people that were written in don't even know they were written in, so they're not interested in the position at all. So my feeling is that, I did look at past history, and from 2010 to 2011, there were 59 full-term positions filled through write-ins, and the average number of votes cast for the winning seat was 18. So it seems fair that if a town meeting rep that's interested in running has to get a minimum of 25 votes, it doesn't seem like a lot to ask for somebody who wants to do a write-in campaign to get a minimum of 10. That's what we're asking for. And it does save a lot of issues when it comes to, again, the failure to elect for tie votes. It saves a lot of issues with having to hold all these individual single votes in reserve. And then also the challenge of how you move them up in the reserve. And I think I just want to go with what Honorina's original request was, and that is to increase keep the minimum votes and increase it to 10. And that's our proposal.
Any questions?
Okay. All right. And Article 21 is actually amending the town code by adding an additional chapter. And basically, we're asking to prohibit any meetings to take place on election day. This is going to become more necessary because with the 2020 census data, it looks like we're probably going to be going from 9 precincts to 11 precincts, which will also necessitate adding another polling location, most likely the town offices. So in order to protect the integrity of the election and just increase security around the elections, we would just prefer to not have meetings allowed in the same space as the elections are taking place. So we're asking for your consideration for Article 21 to be approved as well.
So the only, I'm going to sound like a lawyer, no offense, Jim, but when I read this, or when I read it, my first thought was, well, with early voting, aren't election hours for like 2 weeks? Like it doesn't say election day, it says during election hours. So how does that apply when we have multiple days that you can vote on when you consider just election hours?
Well, that's interesting because I guess the election day is still the election day. Early voting, it's a good point. I mean, I don't mind having an amendment to the language if it meets with town council's approval to say election day. Early voting, I think it would be a little difficult to restrict meetings at town offices for 2 solid weeks before an election day. I wouldn't go that far to ask that. It's not as, I mean, it doesn't go as long either. Early voting technically doesn't go until 8 p.m. and then we're not there counting until all hours of the night either during early voting. So I don't see the problem. So if there's some clarifying there.
I didn't think that was your intent, but when I read it, I'm like, well, I would think somebody might read it that way, or make a case that you can't have a meeting when there's voting going on.
It does say, yeah, I mean.
I think there's a difference between voting and election hours. I mean, but we can check with council.
Yeah.
Some clarification language might be useful there. I see what you're saying.
Mhm.
Has this presented a problem in the past? Are there boards that are meeting during the election days?
There have been, and I thought it was always just a practice that we didn't in the past in prior clerks. I thought it was just a practice, but it's never been in writing. And it just, when we come back with our tapes and we've got our registrars there and there's a lot of activity and getting things back from the polling locations, I just was never comfortable having other people in the building at that time. You're moving ballots from the police cars back down to the vaults. You're kind of all over the building and it just never made me comfortable. So I think it was just a practice that was done. And then lately it seemed like there were a few different committees that were meeting on election night at the town offices. And that's why I requested this article be placed on the warrant.
Are there any particular committees that you're aware of that would this present an issue with? I guess is my next question.
For an election day, I mean, there's a lot of people that are put out on election day, the schools being one of them. I don't know that it would cause a problem per se. I think it's just might be a minor inconvenience that they have to find another location to meet if they have to meet that day. But election days are always on a Tuesday. So the only board I could think of that if they met on Tuesday would be a problem would be the planning board, but they meet on Wednesdays. So that's not an issue.
And is this for only for meetings that are occurring in the town hall itself, or is it for any locations?
Well, any polling locations. So I mean, yeah, senior center and the McCarthy School, and then the town office will probably be our polling location as well.
Okay, so I'm not familiar with this particular section. Does this section fall under polling locations? Because there's no reference to polling locations in the actual change to the bylaw.
No, this is no, there isn't. This is a new section of the town code, and it's under boards and committees. So it's not part of the election, the charter. This is just the town
Okay.
code.
So I guess flowing from that, then my question is, would this prohibit all meetings no matter where they're occurring? Because that's the way I'm reading that.
Yes, yeah, the school committee would not be able to meet at the school administrative offices if there's on election day. That's how that reads, and was the intent to have no elections during election day.
It also frees everybody up to vote.
Okay, I just want to make sure that was the intent, because that's the way it reads.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Is that the, I'm sorry, Trish, is that the final?
That was, Article 21 was my final one. Yep, there was the 4 articles. I think I've gone through all of them. Yeah.
Any other questions? Any questions for the registrars? No, all right. Well, thank you all for being here this evening.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, if we could now move, John, just quickly to Articles 23 through 23. And actually, probably the easiest thing to do is get down to Christina Papadopoulos's presentation. That is at the end of the motion for Article 29, because this would be considered under a consent agenda. I just want to inform the Finance Committee that Christina developed a consolidated article, but with review with Paul Haverty at Town Council, Paul felt it'd be more straightforward to have the components broken up into individual warrant articles. But I think the way that we'll approach this is that we can do it as a consent agenda article, have a consent agenda motion prior to it. Obviously the motions will be there, and then Christina will go into the presentation, much like she would do tonight at the time of town meeting. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Christina, who can review the changes to the stormwater design guidelines, which are amendments to the town zoning bylaw, which is subject to a hearing that the planning board is undertaking.
Welcome.
Oh, good night. Good evening. Thank you. Christina Papadopoulos, town engineer. So just as Paul mentioned, we have Articles 23 through 29. They were all amended within zoning all at the same time. So we're breaking them up, I guess, tonight. So the big question is, why do we need to change these zoning codes? So essentially EPA, through the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, the MS4 permit, that's the permit that allows the town to discharge stormwater to the waters of the US. This MS4 permit requires that permittees, that's the town, must update their regulatory mechanisms this year. So the permittees, that's us, shall develop and implement and enforce a program to address post-construction stormwater runoff from all new development and redevelopment sites that disturb 1 or more acres and discharge into permittees MS4, and that's a minimum requirement. That also permittees must modify the regulations to encourage low impact development. So that's what has been done to modify these zoning codes in those particular ways. The stormwater bylaw that was passed in spring 21 was the first step towards complying with this requirement. So basically these changes in the town code will help keep consistency throughout the town regulations. Because we made those changes in the spring, that now conflicts with all of the other codes that reference stormwater. So now we want to keep everything consistent. Typically I would go through each and every article, but this is sort of to keep in mind for all the articles, right? So if we don't revise all of these articles, then the stormwater regulations remain antiquated and they won't be cohesive with the new stormwater bylaw, and the town would not be in compliance with the EPA MS4 permit. The town may get fined by EPA. Of course, then there are benefits, which is that encourages better landscaping and green infrastructure. It improves the water quality, it encourages groundwater recharge, it improves erosion control, it improves aquatic and wildlife habitat. It provides cohesion with the other stormwater regulations, which is super important, and compliance with the EPA permit, which is our ultimate goal. So these modifications were done. A lot of them were inspired by a lot of workshops that I held with the planning board, they mentioned that they really wanted to really encourage a lot more green infrastructure. They wanted better landscaping. So I looked through the zoning code and looked for places where I could interject some encouragement for better landscaping. So that's where I came up with a lot of them. So starting with Article 23, it's in the off-street parking and loading in the purpose and intent. So basically, we're just adding some language in the purpose and intent of the parking, off-street parking. So it says reduce impervious surfaces and stormwater runoff through sustainable design. What we're doing is adding and encouraging the use of low-impact development, which we're going to call LID, or green infrastructure. So see, it doesn't really change anything, but it just kind of like encourages it. And that's basically what we're doing for the rest of them. And feel free to ask questions if you have questions on anything. Article 24 is about parking. So parking and loading area design and location. These three places, this amendment allows for the use of different kinds of curbing. So curb only, sawtooth curb, and curb cut treatments as needed for LID, stormwater management. Before it was limited to, we just want curbing, give us curbing, but now we're allowing different things to encourage, again, low impact development. It requires that street entrances be designed consistent with the Massachusetts amendments to the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. We call that the MUTCD. Basically, I just updated some language so that we're current with the current regulations. We're using MUTCD now. We had some really old zoning codes, so we're just updating that. The next one allows pervious parking materials as part of a stormwater management design without limiting these materials to, quote, supplemental parking areas where excess parking is necessary. So this actually doesn't change anything. It just removes the limitations of implying that it needs to be that you could have pervious parking only for supplemental parking areas. We don't want to limit that. Actually, in this picture here, you can see how the drive aisle is regular pavement, but the parking stalls are like porous pavement. So it's kind of you could do that kind of design. We want to encourage that. So that's why I made that modification. Next, Article 25. Basically copied the entire passage there just to prove the point, just to show the point that I'm just really replacing the words 2 acres to 1 acre, because the MS4 regulations mean that we need to regulate all projects that are totaling 1 acre or more on any parcel, contiguous parcel in the same ownership or part of a larger development. So I just reworded that so that it's compliant with our stormwater bylaw and all MS4 requirements. So I just changed it from 2 acres to 1 acre. Article 26 is landscaping. I just added an objective G, which is to minimize runoff through green infrastructure and low impact design, LID. Again, just encouraging, not really changing anything. Article 27, the site plan review. We had an old name for the Stormwater Mass DEP Handbook. So I just renamed it with the current name. It's called the Mass DEP Handbook. And it also says that you can reference the stormwater management regulations that the DPW have for a whole list of all your stormwater design requirements. Again, you're not looking in 5 different places. If you're doing a stormwater design, you can just, go to the stormwater regulations, and it's all in one place. So it keeps everything consistent and concise. Article 28, the site plan review, requires that low impact design strategies be used to the maximum extent feasible. Again, it doesn't really change anything, just encourages it. The planning board thing is going to discuss this language about maximum extent feasible at our next meeting. Does it mean financial? Does it mean because of the land? I mean, most of the time when I encounter difficulty with using more green infrastructure, it's because of site constraints, like you don't have really good soil, you're on a really steep slope or things like that. So I would hope that it would not mean that maximum extent feasible financially for a developer, but more so based on what your lot looks like. Article 29, terminology. It just adds the word landscaping to terminology, and just a basic definition of landscaping: the process of making a yard or other piece of land more attractive by altering the existing design, adding ornamental features, and planting trees and shrubs. This can include green infrastructure or low impact design / development (LID), fire retention areas, vegetated swales, planter boxes, rainwater harvesting systems, natural channel design, and other vegetative practices. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and thank you very much for giving me your time.
Is low impact design defined anywhere?
It is in the stormwater bylaw, I believe.
So most of these, like as you mentioned a couple of times, are, encourage, hope. But a couple like the Article 28 one, requires that we use these LID to the maximum extent feasible. And then you said that you hope that doesn't mean financially. Who's to say what that means? Is that up to the planning board?
That's how we discussed it with the planning board. They have the same concern that, when you say something like maximum extent feasible, how does that, who's to say when it is maximum extent feasible? A lot of times, like I said, it's the site that dictates whether you can or cannot do it. And if the planning board decides that they need to push it further and they need to cut something out so that they can increase their landscaping, then that's the planning board's decision. And that's what has to be done for the project to move forward.
So in other words, it's subject to the planning board review and approval.
That's how, yep.
Yeah, so as the article is put forward, the actual language of the article, Eric states that low impact development site planning design strategies must be utilized to the maximum extent feasible. These may include, but are not limited to, the reduction of impervious surfaces, disconnection of impervious surfaces, fire retention, which is the rain gardens, and infiltration systems. So they're looking to say that these are things that they're encouraging to provide, but it's ultimately up to the planning board as to what they require to be done at the site.
Right, so if they say, we really want a rain garden in this location, and the design engineer says it's simply not feasible, the groundwater is way too high, or the soil is not porous enough, then that's what they have to come back, and they have to give a reason why they can't meet the planning board's requirements.
Well, most things are feasible if you spend enough money.
To some degree.
So that's my
or
concern.
Another location.
It puts a lot of uncertainty over what that group of people may or may not want you to spend to be green. Is that language verbatim from the EPA reg?
I would have to, let me see. It just says permittees must modify their regulations to encourage low impact development. So no, it just says that we must encourage it. So
do you know why we landed on saying requires? I think that's the only one that has that strong of a term or word.
Yeah. And is that, let me see, Article 28.
Article 28 doesn't say require, it says.
That's what I was wondering.
On the slide it does.
Yeah, that might be my bad. Let me see.
Requires that low impact design strategies be used to the maximum extent feasible.
Well, it says it in as much words. It does say design strategies must be utilized.
So I don't know why we can't say encourage. If that meets the requirement that we have to have these rules, then why make it stronger than it has to be?
So you're saying should be utilized? we should change the must to the to should be utilized to the maximum extent feasible?
That's just my opinion, but
Okay. Yeah, that it was, this article was a point of discussion among the planning board, so I will certainly take that up with them.
Yeah, I think I agree with Eric on that one. Where should is a little bit,
Yeah.
well, because there's flexibility in the reg, where we're putting in a bylaw to meet the requirements of the reg. I think allowing a little flexibility would reduce that consternation.
Okay.
Any other questions on these bylaw amendments? All right. Thank you, Christina.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you.
Christina, before you go, do you want to do the Duncher Drive easements, the next article?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, because you can do it better than me.
No problem. Okay, so this is Article 30. This is the Duncher Drive easements. So essentially what we're doing is the DPW is working on replacing the two culverts over on Duncher Drive. But while working on the designs to replace these culverts, the culverts are larger than they were before, so the wing walls are extending further than they have previously. There is an existing 30-foot wide drainage easement for Deep Brook, which is what these two culverts carry. And so we found a need to acquire some easements just so that the wing walls and the banks of the property of the stream are within an easement, which is the right thing to do. And that's how we developed that plan. So essentially there's 8 properties that are affected by it. Most are really, really small. Some of the easements are permanent. Like I said, they'd be wing walls, so like hard infrastructure like that. And the rest of them are temporary. So the larger ones are really because we want to be able to get some DPW equipment back there. So we would take a temporary easement. Those temporary easements last about 3 years. And that just would allow the DPW to get in along the brook and do some stream bank mitigation, some stabilization on those stream banks. And that's really just to benefit the neighborhood because it's in a floodplain. So those 8 easements are listed with the in this table, the various areas, and these are not solid areas yet. It's still a working plan because we still don't have the final design plans. Some utilities keep moving around and a lot is going on, but we are coming close to having that finalized. So what happened would be I am in touch with an appraiser. The appraiser would go and visit each of these 8 properties, assess the value of this particular land, and then offer these 8 properties a sum of money to acquire these easements. And this vote would further authorize the select board to acquire these easements through any and all legal means available. Any questions on that?
how does the cost of the temporary easement get sorted out?
That would be up to the professional appraiser to determine.
Okay.
I don't think it's the same, but I'm not positive because I'm not an appraiser.
Is there any known resistance to doing this?
With this neighborhood, we've been in contact with them for a couple of years now because we've been actively working on this project. They're all very excited to finally get new culverts. Their culverts are seriously, failing and in desperate need of repair. So they're quite happy. Every time I visit them, they're happy to see me and want to see this happening sooner rather than later. So no known resistance, especially in this neighborhood, and not in the past that I've heard with other projects either. We're very open and honest with them up front, and they understand what it is. It's just an easement. We're not taking any land. And it's a wing wall, like they, what are they gonna do with the wing wall in their yard? So, yeah.
Especially after this summer's rain, they're probably even more eager to have this done to
Right.
address the flooding problems, which is what brought us there to begin with.
Right. So any other
Any
questions?
other questions? All right, seeing none. Thank you again.
Okay.
Thank you, Christina. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too.
All right, John, if you can bring us back to our Article 1, we'll step through these, rather efficiently, as they are pretty straightforward. Obviously, Article 1 is customary at every town meeting, is the reports of town officers and committees, so there's no vote or presentation to the Finance Committee this evening. Recognizing that we're in a COVID situation, we're going to keep that pretty short. John is required under the town is required under the town bylaws to present the five-year financial forecast. John will present that evening. And I think I'll also just give a financial overview of the warrant to a benefit of the town meeting body. And then I think, given the timeliness of the completion of the North Fire Station and the fact that the town will be considering plans for future of the substations, we'll have a quick report on that and probably photos. So that's what will happen under Article 1. From there, we move over to Article 2, which is, following consent agenda, where we'll take Articles 2 through 8 and then 10 and 15 and 16 together. You'll see that these articles are customary at every fall town meeting for the most part, and we'll walk through them. The first one is Article 2, and that's the ongoing cemetery improvement and development fund. It's $50,000, and it's for the ongoing work at the Pine Ridge Cemetery expansion. John, if you want to go on to the slide number 10, and you could probably best describe the work at Pine Ridge, since you are a cemetery commissioner now, John. So you're more qualified than I am to speak to the work going on there.
Sure, thank you, Paul. So if any of you have had the chance to visit Pine Ridge Cemetery, you know that when you drive up the hill, and there's an area that was cleared in the back, it's going up behind the Forest Street area, and that there you'll see a road that currently has a gravel base, but it needs a base coat of pavement. Our superintendent of cemeteries has been working with contractors on this. There are 2 new sections that need to have mapping done, and also the placement of numbered lot markers. And those are the things that delineate the actual cemetery lots from each other. Cemetery lots in the new section are targeted to be available by next July. So the main issue there is to have the road in so that the folks that are doing the survey and the mapping can use the road as a baseline for the survey. And then in the next part of the work is the construction of a 4th columbarium, also known as a niche wall. The niche wall that was installed back in March is 50% sold. So if you're unfamiliar with those, niches are basically you're buying basically a cubicle, if you will, in a nice granite structure called a columbarium. So it's a way to use space more efficiently rather than ground burial. So that's really the work that's planned for Pine Ridge in the future.
If there are no questions on Article 2, we can move on to Article 3. Article 3 is the again, annual appropriation at fall town meeting of the Commonwealth Transportation Infrastructure Fund. And this year the amount is $57.58, which is down from the previous year as a result of the pandemic. I believe the state revenues were down, over 50%. I think it was close to 60% on that as a result of the, fewer people using ride share services. So how this works is there's a 20-cent per ride assessment. Half of that goes to the community, half goes to the Commonwealth. We have to annually appropriate this fund and then report our expenditure to the state. If you go to you can see in this next slide, the 57.58, again, since it's a factor of 10 cents, you can see that was 57,580 rides. And you can see the prior year, we had 106,969 rides. And then the first year of the funding, we had 78,000 rides. So you can see clearly the impact from the pandemic. And so again, we'll appropriate these monies, towards a project, and I'll probably have it identified by town meeting. You may recall last year we used the $10,000 towards the construction of those LED flashing stop signs at Graniteville Road and School Street. So again, this is a ministerial article, but we're required to do it. It's not ministerial when you're in a community like Boston or Cambridge. You can imagine the millions of dollars in revenues they receive from rideshare services. So thank you. If there are no questions on Article 3, we'll then move to the next consent agenda article, which is Article 4. And this is transferring funds, in this case, $83,045 from free cash to the Sewer Construction Stabilization Fund. And once again, I'll turn this over to John Souza, our finance director, who can just sort of explain to you how this happens and why it happens. Go ahead, John.
Thank you. So many of you have seen this in past years. The reason for this is that, as you know, all of the sewer construction work that was performed after 2005, the debt service for that work is actually not paid with tax dollars, but we have two sources of revenue that we collect to pay for it, which are sewer betterments and the Sewer Capital Improvement Fund, which is a surcharge on the sewer rate. So our long-term financial plan to pay for all the debt service for all those phases includes the interest on those earnings. So under Massachusetts general law, all of the interest, unless there's a provision for it, flows into the general fund. So the interest that we earned during the prior year on these funds flowed into the general fund. And this is why we need a vote from town meeting to transfer the $83,045 from interest from our free cash into the Sewer Construction and Stabilization Fund. And by putting it in the Stabilization Fund, it will be reserved for use in future years to pay that debt service that I discussed. So if there's any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer those.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. We'll then move on to the next consent agenda article, which is the Affordable Housing Stabilization Fund. Darlene Lucy, our town accountant, mentioned in her report, this year, the amount of funds that are available that were collected under the zoning bylaw payment in lieu of program, which is when affordable housing units are constructed, that the developer negotiates with the planning board to make a payment in lieu of constructing affordable units that is then used to construct further affordable units by a vote of town meeting. Again, this is just putting money into the fund from the monies that were paid during the prior year negotiations. You can see it's a rather modest amount. This past year, $16,250, and the current fund balance, as Darlene noted in her report, is $620,560. So again, this puts the monies into the fund, and then at a future town meeting, if a project were to come forward, such as the one Darlene mentioned, like David Hedison doing a project, we'd have to bring it to town meeting for a 2/3 vote to appropriate these monies. So again, this is a housekeeping article in accordance with the town zoning bylaw. So if there are no questions on that, we'll then move on to Article 6, which again falls under the consent agenda, and that's for collective bargaining. There are no action being taken under this article. Again, we keep this as a placeholder. So we'll then move to Article 7, which is unpaid bills from the prior fiscal year. And for the first time in years, we have an unpaid bill for a prior fiscal year. As you can see, it's $200.60 for a police detail payment to the town of Dracut, going back to June of 16. So I'm going to turn this over to Darlene Lucy, who can explain how this sort of appeared. I know the answer, but we haven't heard from Darlene in a little while, because she's the one that brought this to my attention.
I did. So I got an email from the treasurer collector over at in Dracut, saying that he had an invoice for me from an unpaid detail bill. He was going through and doing some reconciliations of some old outstanding bills that they had, and this one he had for the town of Chelmsford. So he emailed it over to me. I told him I would do some research on it, kind of see maybe if it had been paid. Couldn't find anything on this. Actually it was when we were doing some work over on Weston Ave. DPW does remember even the job, but we just don't see this invoice being paid. So in good faith, I mean, we really do. We do owe the bill. The invoice date was October 31st of 2016, but I feel like, I know it's small, but we really do need to pay this bill. So I did tell him that we did have to bring this to town meeting, get approval for payment, that once I'm sure that town meeting will approve $200.60 to pay a detail bill, but once that's paid, we'll get him those funds right away. But it's nothing that's been on nobody's radar. So it's not like it's been sitting on somebody's desk. I mean, it was 2016. I'm not sure where this invoice had been. It was addressed to DPW, but nobody seemed to know anything about it. So we just want to get this paid.
I think the most fascinating part of the story is that the current Drake town manager was the former finance director, and yet her successor is the one who found this unpaid bill from prior fiscal year. But anyway, that's just inside humor for people who do this stuff. But anyway, we'll process that. And because it's an unpaid bill from a prior fiscal year, it does require a 4/5 vote of town meeting. So we'll bring that there under consent. The next one is Article 8, any amendments to the current fiscal year operating budget. Again, we put this as a placeholder, and as Darlene reported earlier, we're fine, and so we're taking no action under this article. And then now we get to Article 9, where we leave the consent agenda and we get to some of the substantive nature of the financial aspects of the town meeting. And the first one is to provide funding for roadway and sidewalk construction. As was noted in Darlene's presentation, the free cash was certified at $5.67 million. I provided to you, as I provided to the select board, a financial plan regarding the uses of those funds, of which $3 million would go to property tax relief ultimately, and then $2 million for road construction, roughly. The sewer enterprise stabilization fund that John spoke of, 83,000, and then there'll be 600,000 for PFAS remediation at Richardson Road in the subsequent articles. So here again, we're looking for 1.987, which is the balance of to even out the whole exact dollar on the free cash certification. So again, the context of this is that the primary source of the town's road construction funding is Chapter 90 road construction, which is basically your excise tax when one fills up their gas tank at a service station. This program has basically been level funded by the Commonwealth for the past 9 years. We receive 1.15 million annually in Chapter 90 funding. Unfortunately, as has been documented by the Mass Municipal Association and others, this is really, sadly, only about a third of what's required to maintain the town's roadway infrastructures across the Commonwealth. And in fact, when the state completed their funding surplus for the fiscal year that just ended, one of the asks from the Municipal Association was for the state to put another $200 million in recognizing to address this problem. And of course, that hasn't occurred at this time. But we do realize that there are, improvements that are warranted in the town's roadway infrastructure. The select board hears them, I hear them, you probably hear them. The two predominant issues in the community are usually taxes and roadway conditions, potholes and roadway surfaces and such, and sidewalks. So when I reached out and met with the DPW director, Gary Persichetti, and Steve Youngley, our assistant director, I said, well, what's your capability? In other words, what is it that could be done if funding were available? And they believe they can perform an additional $1 million in roadway construction during current fiscal year with the resources they have and the ability to contract and so forth. And so what I'm proposing is to basically appropriate the almost $2 million. It would take place at one time because the warrant article transcends the fiscal year, but the expectation is about half of that would get expended in each of the remainder of this current fiscal year. Again, where you're talking a construction cycle that's really going to begin next spring, summer, fall, and then the following spring, summer, fall. So again, this is an effort to provide some funding towards the the town's roadway conditions. And then the next question becomes, well, what roadways are going to be done? The DPW does have a roadway construction plan, and it's based on a roadway condition inventory. In fact, they're in the process of updating that inventory. But again, we in that plan will be presented at a select board meeting. The Chelmsford nor any community really, you don't bring the road specifically for funding to town meeting. You bring the funding request, and then within the, whether it's Chapter 90 or, you know, the town's capital funding that we provide for roadway construction, we bring that you know, request forward, and do the work that's being performed. So that's really where we are under this article. And again, we'd ask your support and town meeting support to you know, make the necessary improvements in our road and sidewalk conditions. Moving on to Article 10. Oh, good. If there are questions under none.
Just before you head on from this one, I know that there was some discussion at the prior town meeting regarding sidewalks in schools. And I don't know if that's been looked at and at least considered by Gary and by Steve. But in the addition of these funds, I would strongly recommend that at least there be a look at that. So I know there was some concern from parents regarding walking to schools and some sidewalks in certain areas.
Yeah, and I do know on their list they are looking at the old Westford Road area, and such areas of town. But again, that's part of the discussion and public discussions that we will have in the community. So yes, that we heard that loud and clear at the last town meeting.
Paul, I thought I heard you say that the select board would review or get a presentation on the assessment of our roads. Correct?
Yes.
Will that be shared with the finance committee?
Sure. Yeah. Yes. Like I said, I've seen the preliminary plan for roadway paving, and what's going on right now is there's a reassessment going on of the plan because it's been a few years since they went out and did the physical inventory. But when that is complete, it'll be presented to the select board, and we come present it to the finance committee as well. But there's no doubt that further funding is needed, and that's what we're seeking here is to set some funding aside for those needs.
Yeah, and my only other, it's really a comment, but Gary feels he can handle an additional $1 million, but will that include using out additional resources beyond our own in-town?
Yeah. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, that work would be performed by private vendors, you know, paving companies. Basically, when I say they're limited resources, it's, you know, do you have the engineering oversight and management to perform additional work? No, we certainly couldn't do $1 million of roadway or sidewalk work with our current forced labor accounts. We just don't have the resources to do that. You're correct. So yes, this work would be done by hiring companies. The concern we have, and you recognize this, is, you know, we're in a bit of an inflationary environment right now with you know, gasoline, you know, petroleum commodities, which factors this, as well as, you know, a difficult labor thing. So one of the things we're going to be mindful of is, you know, we just don't want to be putting the most expensive roadways and sidewalks in that have been in the town's history, because others are looking at this type of work as well. So that's what makes us a little hesitant to say, well, how many extra miles of roadway would be paved or how many extra feet of sidewalks are paved, is because, you know, there is a bit of an inflationary factor that's going on out there. But yes, this will be bid and work done under vendors. You know, that's generally how it is. We just don't have, nor would we want to add employees to do that type of work.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay, then Article 10 was a placeholder that we put on in case there was to be sewer capital improvements. And fortunately, the American Rescue Plan Act provides an allowance to use some of the $10.7 million that the town will receive under the program over the next, that we can be expended over the next 4 fiscal years towards sewer and stormwater improvement. So at this town meeting, I'm proposing that the town take no action. In the months and weeks ahead, the select board will be holding hearings on how to allocate the American Rescue Plan Act funds. So rather than getting ahead of that, we'll take no action. And then once this sort of becomes a plan for the use of the town's ARPA monies or American Rescue Plan Act monies, we'll make sure and come back perhaps at a spring or a subsequent town meeting just to see if there are any additional capital improvements that need to be funded by the town's resources, either the sewer enterprise fund free cash that Darlene spoke of or otherwise. But at this point, we're going to hold the article in abeyance until we have the particular use of an alternative funding source. So the next article is Article 11, and this is for the PFAS remediation at 54 Richardson Road. The request is an appropriation of $600,000 from free cash to address that. There was a presentation at the select board meeting 3 nights ago, this past Monday, on the initial plan. The licensed site professional from West End Sampson Engineers, Paul McKinley, is scheduled to return to the select board meeting in 2 weeks on the 27th with the finalization of that plan, because we have to submit the town's proposal to the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection by the 11th of October. And then obviously once that's approved, we have to commence with the work. And obviously what we're dealing with here is PFAS, which I hate using acronyms because people say, what are you talking about? It's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, that have been detected in the majority of the monitoring wells at 54 Richardson Road, because that's a site that the town has active monitoring wells. And why? It's because this is an area that's in close proximity to the North Chelmsford Water District's Bowman wells, which is obviously a source of water supply in the community. The suspected area of the PFAS contamination is basically at the highway garage structure that's existed on that site for decades. And, again, we're talking parts per trillion in terms of components. And again, for a site that's been used as a highway yard for decades, they certainly weren't using the best management practices or the current practices that exist in today's society. And so this appears to be residual effects from prior uses at the property. Again, our plan is being regulated and reviewed and will be approved by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. And basically the plan here is to do what they call in situ treatment, which is you basically install wells and then you pump the wells, you treat them, and then re-inject the groundwater for years in order to remove the PFAS. And this is a pretty tried and true process for groundwater contamination. You even see the water district, do treatment where they aerate wells and so forth for iron and other materials and so forth. But in this case, it's PFAS. They've used carbon filters. So you'll have an ongoing pump and treat system at that site. And the estimate that we have at this time from the engineers is $600,000 is needed to perform this work. And then obviously once the work is performed, it becomes, reassessments and ongoing monitoring. And so the 600,000 should carry us forward, certainly at least, through spring town meeting and perhaps further, depending upon the results of what goes on out there. So again, this is a process that's still in process in terms of development with the input of the water district, the select board, and ultimately the DEP. But at this point, the best estimate we have right now would be $600,000 for this work. If there are no further questions, I can move on to Article 12, which is Freeman Lake weed control. Here, the request is to raise and appropriate $65,000 to treat the non-native invasive weeds, aquatic plant species in formal terms, that are predominant right now in Freeman Lake. And what's going on here is the extraordinary weather conditions we had this summer of the huge amounts of rainfall, as well as the warm, unusually seasonal warm weather that we had in June, and even some of the warmer weather through the end of the summer, has just cause havoc on weeds in the region. I mean, this is not a Chelmsford specific or a lake specific problem. This is a major water body concern that we're dealing with. Here in the case of Freeman Lake, it's 82 acres. The density and the abundance of plant species that are out there, in speaking to the experts and looking at the guidance from the Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, is that the best way to approach it at this time, given their lake management guides, is to utilize an herbicide that's regulated and approved by the U.S. Department of Environmental Protection, as well as the Massachusetts regulatory agencies, and that's the herbicide known as fluoridone. So basically, what it is you apply this chemical, which after the ice melts and you get to the early spring conditions, it's the installers put it in, with pellets and so forth. And basically, it's a long-lasting type of chemical, meaning the duration of it stays on the plants for a period of time. And then basically, it not only kills the plants, but goes in and kills the roots. And it's proven, yes, you have to always do ongoing spot treatment in subsequent years. But this is really what's necessary in this current condition that's out there right now. We've been a partner with the Hart Pond Association over the years and managing weed control with herbicides at Hart Pond. So again, when the Freeman Lake situation got so bad that we had to close the lake for swimming at the beach because it was out of control. I mean, we actually had one point we had DPW going in there doing weed removal, and within a matter of days it was back covered again. So anytime you apply any kind of an herbicide or chemical to water and water supply, there are concerns. So again, not only looking at the regulatory materials and reaching out to the company that did the work at Hart Pond, we sent the information out to the North Chelmsford Water District, to our Board of Health, to the Conservation Commission. We received the correspondence back from the North Chelmsford Water District saying, look, they've looked into this. As long as you've got registered people who know what they're doing, there's no risk to the water supply. And so, and similar feedback we're receiving back from the Board of Health who've met on this, and Conservation is meeting on this and speaking to the chair and vice chair that they see it as the path forward and maybe something they might want to apply in the mill pond at a future date. But so this is what needs to get done. And then I think there's an effort, and thoughts will come into with subsequent years, is, do we spot treat? There are other ways of doing it, when like mechanical harvesters and so forth. But at this point, given what's out there, this is the preferred way to go. So that's what we're proposing under this article. Obviously, if it's approved by town meeting, and why it has to be done this fall is you really got to get up there in the spring. So we really can't wait till spring town meeting to do this work. So if town meeting approves it, we'll do the procurement and then have the work done in the springtime. You can imagine the demand that these folks are under right now. And so that's why I've gone conservative with the number to make sure that we have an adequate, because it was hard to get these people to provide me with a cost estimate because they're just straight out. But fortunately, we had looked into this 3 years ago, so they already were familiar with the pond and so forth, and they were able to refresh the number. So, are there any questions on Article 12 regarding Freeman Lake weed control? Okay. Seeing none, the next article, Article 13, is the application of free cash to reduce the property tax levy. Here, the request is to transfer $2 million from free cash to reduce the levy for the current fiscal year. I know many of you will recall we appropriated $2 million a year ago at fall town meeting to reduce the tax levy for fiscal year 21 that was completed last June 30th. That came from the Stabilization Fund at that time. We're seeking $2 million of the free cash balance at this point to basically replicate that this year. What does this mean? As you may recall, the current average single-family property tax bill in the community right now is $7,400 on a property that's assessed at $470,000. the $1 million is approximately $70 on the average single family property tax bill. So the mindset here is to replicate the $70, because even if we are to do nothing, in terms of the budget or other change, we know there's going to be a shift towards residential, because residential values are shifting or appreciating faster than commercial values. So again, this is a way of providing some tax relief. And then the extra $1 million, the third million, we can't appropriate in advance of the next fiscal year. So the thought I have is to put the $1 million into the stabilization fund, with the intent a year from now of appropriating that to adjust the fiscal year 23 property tax levy, because as Darlene noted, this was an anomaly this year. We're certainly not expecting this level of free cash a year from now. We certainly didn't, experience it in past fiscal years, and the extraordinary conditions are not likely to replicate themselves. And so the idea is that if the funding's set aside, if there isn't sufficient funds to reduce the levy, and the budgets, are demand for services in an inflationary environment or otherwise, with new collective bargaining agreements and others that would go into effect in 23 are tight, then at least that $1 million would allow us to moderate out of that tax relief assistance in a future year, as opposed to having a large spike in property taxes. And that sort of is the converse argument of, well, why not apply more funding to this year's tax levy? And it's just because it's really not sustainable, and then you're sort of could be setting people expectations up for future years that can't be obtained in terms of financial impacts. And that really, as you know, many of you who pay mortgages and such through escrow accounts, it can cause havoc, because oftentimes your taxes are a significant part of your escrow account. And so we really want to not sort of go to a place that causes a lack of understanding or financial preparedness on how we would get out of this situation. So the plan is basically, as noted, would be to once again appropriate $2 million to the tax levy this fiscal year.
Paul, just a couple of questions on that. So if $1 million equates to roughly $70 for the average taxpayer, so that's $140, does that essentially wash with what we expect assessed values to go up? So people won't be getting a $140 reduction in taxes. Will it offset what we expect the appraisals to go up?
No, and in fact, what's going to happen, if you think about it, we applied $140 last year. So this year we apply $140. There's no impact in terms of the base. What's going to happen this year is you're going to have the shift in valuation, because residential values, I think, John, you can correct me, I think they're appreciating at about 7%, and commercial values are only appreciating about 2%. So you're going to have a shift towards residential. Plus, you're going to have the 2.5% increase in the levy capacity as well. So again, if the average bill is $7,400, that bill is going up. So I don't want people to think that they're going to see the tax bill go down, and that's why we try to be cautious and explain to people that you're not going to see your taxes go down. What we're basically saying is this money will be applied in order to moderate what otherwise would be your tax bill for the year. So yes, what's going to happen when the assessors come in November to present the classification report is you're going to see an increase in valuation. So your average single family value will go up, and then your average single family tax bill is going to go up as well, because of the fact that the levy goes up. It's like I said, what it's just doing is it's tempering what otherwise would occur. But given the fact that we used the same dollar amount last fiscal year, you're not going to see any impact. So in other words, you're not going to see $140 savings, because you already had the $147 savings last year.
Okay, thanks. And on my memory's failing, but when we did the 2022 budget, we did not incorporate anything of that 10.7 million, right? Or did we factor the half that we're going to get into this year's fiscal year budget?
I'm confused with the 10.7 million.
The money that we're getting from the federal government for COVID.
Oh, no, that doesn't apply. That's a grant. That doesn't apply to the tax levy or the town's financial operations. That's basically equivalent of grant monies that stand separately and stand alone. So no, that's not incorporated in the town's budget, nor can it be. You can't use those Federal Rescue Plan Act monies to supplant the town's operating budget. You can apply those monies towards towards qualifying COVID related. And most of that's really going to go to, just while we're on that, if you raise the subject, most of that's going to continue to go towards COVID related expenses, most notably the HVAC operations in municipal buildings. We're incurring, staffing level, elevated staffing levels right now, as we did the past school year in the schools, to make sure the HVAC response is quick in the air quality standards at the schools. We also have some capital projects that are under development for replacement of HVAC units at school buildings. There's an assessment taking place in the town office building, which is a 100-year-old building that does not have adequate air exchange. Same thing at the McKay Library, and we're also going through all the buildings. So that's where a bulk of the funding is going to go to. But again, that's not the town's operating budget. And then also, like I said, you'll have some sewer and stormwater and other projects that will come in towards the American Rescue Plan Act monies as well. So again, that will all be discussed at hearings, but no, that's totally separate from the town's $144.5 million operating budget.
Thank you.
Paul, I'm
Yes.
sorry, Eric, did you have another question?
Nope, I think that was Dave.
Paul,
Yes.
I'm shocked that I never asked this question before, but here it goes. Do other towns use their free cash to offset the tax levy?
Some towns do. I
Is it,
don't know how to describe it other than that. Some towns do.
it seems somewhat unique.
Let me answer the question this way, because I said this, discussed this with the select board on Monday evening. And you would know as finance committee members, there are legitimate uses and needs for funding in this community, whether it's deferred capital that we've seen in the past, whether it's the OPEB liability that's out there, or unfunded pension liability. You've heard staffing concerns from department. I mean, there are a number of legitimate uses that's out there. This is the priority, of being presented to you that really derives from the select board as the chief, elected officials of our community. And again, it does follow the pattern that we did a year ago when we applied money for tax relief during the pandemic. And there are many people who are still suffering from the pandemic, so we don't want to lose sight of that. But yes, there are communities who will use the cash reserves and even the ARPA funds to supplant lost revenues or to reduce which really is a way of reducing the tax levy to provide relief. Other things that could be done, and I mentioned this the other night, is you could put it into the Stabilization Fund. And you likely, if you took the 5.6 million, you'd probably get a AAA bond rating, because as John can note, when we spoke to our Standard & Poor's financial advisors and regulatory advisors earlier this week, one of the things they noted was the town's lack of reserves is the item that hinders us from getting the ultimate prize of a AAA bond rating. However, as I explained to the select board, it might be nice to champion a AAA bond rating, but the change in interest rates you would get as a AAA rated community versus a AA plus where we are now is not material compared to the amount of funding that you'd have to set aside. But Kathy, it's all over the place. I mean, Billerica as a community has twice as much free cash as we have, even though they don't have twice in terms of cash reserves, even though they don't have twice as much the budget. It really is whatever the financial policy and political climate and environment is within a community as to how the town uses its cash reserves.
I appreciate that. Since you somewhat tagged the capital improvement needs, and since we nominated a person to be on the capital planning committee, having sat on that committee, every year there are so many requests that are great things that need to be done, urgent things, and they have to be declined because there just isn't enough money in capital improvements. And those seem like those are a long-term investment in the town versus this remediation of taxes. That's just, I'd rather see the money spent for the capital plan and any number of other things. But that's,
again, that's ultimately what town meeting decides. In terms of what's done. I mean, yeah, I mean, I can tell you when I spoke to department heads, I mean, Gary Ryan said, well, geez, we're lining up some additional fire apparatus replacement, which we know runs around $1 million per engine. And, so there, as I said earlier, there are legitimate needs. But then you see the other side of the coin is, you then read that 10% of the population in the Commonwealth is classified at poverty level. So again, it really comes down to whatever the community decides to do is the right thing. This is what I put forth as a proposal in light of the town's actions in recent years, and given the competing needs, ultimately the town will decide what the appropriate answer is.
I appreciate all your effort.
Well, one last comment, really. Are you you probably already know the answer, but are you at all concerned that we're starting to set a precedent of going into the stabilization fund to lower taxes, because that tends to be a town meeting issue, and we've been pretty good at not allowing, well, that may not be the right terms, but making good decisions around, applying free cash to the needs of the town without taking money out of the stabilization fund. I don't know if I said that right.
Yeah, no, I get what you get. And in fact, that was the environment that was present when I arrived in the community back almost 15 years ago now. The town had been withdrawing more from the stabilization fund than it had been putting into the fund. And basically the town's reserves were so depleted that it resulted in two actions. One is the town's bond rating got diminished. And also the Department of Revenue came out and paid a visit. It was my first couple of months here, and said, hey, look, you've got to, take corrective actions because you're living beyond your means. So that is something that we're mindful of, and I'm mindful of, is you don't want to get into a situation where you're, again, and I kind of mentioned earlier, where you're sort of at an artificial funding level, and that's why obviously I'm not proposing any of this go towards recurring operating costs. But I think, but again, we're in such an extraordinary time. As you recall, last year, and you heard Darlene's discussion about the revenue trend. You could have, in fact, when we were on the call earlier this week with Standard & Poor's, their economists there, I mean, nobody foresaw what would happen a year later, where we are now, in terms of the fact that communities, municipalities, the states, and others would finish the year in as strong a financial condition as turned out to be the case. And then now here we are in a situation where our future is a little still murky because of the resurgence in the variant, even though we already have the virus, but we don't have adequate vaccine levels. So we're still in a bit of uncertain waters, and again in an odd inflationary environment. So again, we're in an extraordinary time. I think that's why I don't go above the 2 million, and that's why I suggest take that third million and put it into the stabilization fund, so that we can at least gradually climb our way out of it in the event that there is a sense of more normalcy, where we're returning to free cash levels of around 1 or 2% of our budget, as opposed to the level that we're at right now. So that's, I guess, David, I'm mindful of it, and that's why I sort of did this multi-year plan, because again, think what happens, and this is what happened is if your bill is $7,500, use round numbers, and you can do the math. If you're at a 2.5% increase, again, assuming there's no shift in values and what have you, and not also with the values within residential, but anyway, if you're looking at a $200 plus increase by result of the Proposition 2.5 allowed increase in the levy, and then you throw another 140 on top of it, you can just see that number is just a large number that you don't want people having to take on at a given point in time. And so that's why my sense was, well, let's replicate the 2 million we did on the year we just finished, and then set the other $1 million aside so that if we do have to, no one can sustain this practice, that we then have the ability at least to step out of it. So that 140 would get on to 70, and then we get down to 0 in the event there is the cash available. And again, we're in such a strange environment. My bigger concern, quite frankly, is inflation. In terms of not only products and goods and services, but wage inflation, which has to do with payment of employees and collective bargaining. And, the challenge in Massachusetts is Proposition 2.5 is 2.5% regardless of your inflationary environment. But when you're in an inflationary environment, it's much more challenging because obviously your costs are growing greater than your ability to levy within the levy limit. And that's a concern in terms of how do you sustain your level of operations when you know that an override is not attainable, or desirable. And that's the concern that the other thing is you look at your growth, your new growth. Right now, there's not a lot of activity going on in the community in terms of projects. Dowling noted the Thermo Fisher $1 million permit. Well, there's not another Thermo Fisher on the horizon that we see that's going to provide not only the permit revenue, but also the new growth commercial valuation revenue that accompanies it. Nor are we seeing any more residential multifamily development. The only one that's out there right now is the UMass West Campus, is the big one, and that's a bit uncertain at this point in time. And even if it were to be resolved later this fall, you're probably not going to see the impact of that for a couple of fiscal years by the time that is approved, permitted, constructed, and then gets on the assessed valuations. So that's giving us pause. And again, John's incorporating this into the financial forecast. So long-winded way of saying we're a little cash rich, but not a sustainable level of financial resources as we move forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think the toothpaste came out the tube when we started a couple of years ago, both addressing free cash and stabilization funds towards it. And we had that discussion. I can't remember which tri-board meeting it was. We had a discussion where we looked at it and said, okay, so what's this going to look like next year when it jumps and there's nothing to temper it with? And I think we're very fortunate that we have something to temper it with, but I think we kind of have to look at tempering it because the concern was a large jump between fiscal years for tax bills. So I think we're kind of already there, and it's a happy circumstance that we're able to at least try to transition out of that.
Yeah, my biggest fear, and what keeps me up at night, is if we have to transition out of it and we're in a downward economic period. I mean, right now, yeah, it strains the unemployment numbers, but basically people can find work, and we see the employment levels in the community. But many of us lived through the crisis of 2008 and so forth, and you saw people who were struggling because they couldn't find work, and at that point, their largest asset, which was their home, was depreciating and struggling, and to the point where people basically, I heard it, you heard it, they really couldn't sell their house for what they, were sort of in for it. And that's the concern, is right. You don't want to be leveraging yourself. And then if there's a downward turn in an uncertain economy, that you're getting the worst of all worlds, that you're in a downward bit of a period. And then also you're having your tax, bill, increase for level services.
So if I could just make one comment for any of the random people that might actually hear this,
watching this,
kind of following on Kathy's point, because I remember talking to Chief Ryan last year about, and I think even during the capital discussion, an engine is coming. An engine is $1 million. We're basically you're saying $1 million is $70 off the average tax bill. So for $6 a month, if every property owner was willing to pay $6 a month, we could buy a fire engine. Just a different way to think about what a $2 million or a $1 million towards the levy really counts towards. It's about $6 a month you're going to save that could, in essence, buy a fire engine. That's it. Thanks.
Okay. So if there are no further questions or comment, the next article is the free cash to the stabilization fund. And as we've gone through the point, this would be the transfer of the $1 million balance into the stabilization fund. As Darlene noted, the balance right now is 10.9 million. With the town having $144.5 million operating budget, we're right at the midpoint of a $10.9 million stabilization fund is 7.5% of our operating budget, and the town's financial policy say we should be between 5 and 10%. So that's why we're not, proposing anything beyond this $1 million transfer, which we envision may get moved out in fiscal year 23. Yep. Okay. We then move on to another consent agenda article, which is what Darlene spoke of earlier. This is the Community Preservation Fund unexpended appropriations, and I'm not going to repeat them because Darlene did a great job of just highlighting those earlier. So that's what 15 is. And then again, it just goes back to the preservation fund. And then 16 is a rescission for the unused borrowing authority for the Warren Pole property. So I'll turn this over to John, because John was one who worked with bond counsel to, clear this off of our books. So go ahead, John.
Sure. Thank you, Paul. So the reason for doing this is back when we all met at special town meeting, as you recall, town meeting authorized 1.2 million. When we go to borrow for projects, we always try to minimize the amount that we borrow if we can. And in this case, we were able to, the appraisal and survey costs were actually less than budgeted. And all that was about a $50,000 savings. And then we had another $25,000 savings because the initial down payment that the town paid the property owners when we acquired the land was actually paid out of another CPF cash account, so we didn't need to borrow for that. So that's the reason for the $75,000 reduction. So this action will just clear this off. It's called unissued, authorized but unissued debt, and it will clear it off our books.
Okay, thank you. If there's no questions on that, which is pretty understandable, we'll go to Article 17, which is one I submitted, not the Board of Registrars, and it's a charter change. And really what this is, it's ministerial, but we have to do it. And this amends the provision of the town charter that speaks to the composition of the housing authority, even though the housing authority is technically not part of the town's operations in terms of governance in the town. And under Massachusetts law, housing authorities fall under the municipal charter program. So basically what happened is the state passed the law last fall where they changed the composition of housing authority, the 5-member housing authorities, where it used to be you would elect 4 members and the state would appoint the 5th member. Now what they did is they put on a tenant board member. And in fact, the select board just appointed that person a few months ago. So technically now only 3 members of the housing authority are elected. The 4th member is a town appointed tenant board member in accordance with the provision of state law as known there, as printed there in the underlying text. And then the 5th member is appointed by the Secretary of Communities and Development. So this is housekeeping, because even if we didn't change the charter, we still have to do it anyway. But really it's a matter to, good practice to have our charter conform with the requirements and obligations of state law. So that's what this article is. So again, we'd ask your consideration of this and the voters' approval, much like and then if they are approved, then they go on the ballot next spring and then eventually, get into the charter document. And then the last article that we haven't covered under the warrant is Article 22. And this is the demolition delay general bylaw. And I've been looking all night to see if Deb Tavern is here. I thought she could make it, but anyway, I can explain it because it's pretty straightforward. What's going on here is this is the demolition delay bylaw, and an issue arose within the last year, but well, what if a property owner couldn't identify the age of the building? And so what they basically agreed to is they struck that language and said the property owner will provide an inventory of the building or structure to be demolished and that would be prepared by an historic preservation consultant following the approved state guidelines. So again, this is clarifying language that the Historical Commission developed in consultation with Town Council Paul Haverty, that under the town's demolition delay, and again, it's a demolition delay bylaw. It's not, the town can't prohibit demolition, but what it can do is it can provide the town with the ability to get an inventory on the property. And that's basically what this clarifying language does, is it specifies that if you can't specify with certainty the exact age of the building or structure, basically they're just changing it so that you have to provide a inventory by a historic preservation consultant with the state guidelines. So that's what's taking place here. Again, a minor change to the bylaw as a result of an issue that arose with the current bylaw.
I assume the cost of that consultant is borne by the property owner?
Yes, yes.
Any further questions? All right, seeing none. Does that bring us to the end of all the warrant articles?
That's all the warrant articles. And as I mentioned at the outset, there's 30 articles. You can see there's 17 being taken under consent, the first 10 financial and then the 7 under the zoning amendments resulting in the stormwater. So it's my hope, and I'll probably regret saying this, that we could probably get this done in one evening based upon our recent experiences with town meeting in the COVID environment. But I'll just reiterate, at this point, the plan is to have town meeting at the senior center on October 18th. Obviously with masks per the Board of Health guide, suggestion or guideline. So obviously the moderator and I and others, are encouraged, and I know the moderator and I will wear masks, and I imagine most will. But the plan is to go to the senior center that evening, and based on what we've seen in recent COVID town meetings, I think the hope and expectation is we could get this done in one evening.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. Do we anticipate there being any changes or any action on the no action articles between now and town meeting? No. Okay.
No. No.
Fair enough. And then I know I saw some of the discussion on Monday night from the select board regarding the property down on Princeton. And I know that initially they targeted trying to get on to fall town meeting. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. And I know there's some discussion about a special town meeting potentially. Do we have any further discussion on that, and any kind of target as to where that might be?
And I spoke on Tuesday afternoon to Melissa Robbins, who's the representative for the project applicant. Their intent is to come to the town this fall. However, the logistics of doing it, we think, are probably in. I think is probably in the November timeframe, but certainly before Thanksgiving. I think because the logistics of calling a special town meeting are rather straightforward. You need 14 days to post the warrant, so that's not the issue. The issue is that you have to advertise the zoning hearing, and then you've got to get the warrant out and so forth. I think that you're probably talking perhaps 2 months from now for a town meeting. There's a joint meeting between the select board and the planning board with the proposed developer in the next 2 weeks. At that point in time, I believe they're going to present the bylaw. They're going to present the development agreement that would fall under the overlay bylaw. And then I think the discussion will be to move forward towards town meeting in terms of what's a suitable date. I just don't see how it could happen. And that's why it wasn't on, the language wasn't done, hadn't been reviewed by council And even if it were on this warrant, we wouldn't have had, it would have taken a night on its own anyway. So basically, I just see that probably happening in the November timeframe with a warrant being signed in October. And, you know, and again, as soon as we get wind of those dates, we'll notify you. So what would happen in that scenario is you would have not only the zoning article, but then if all goes to the current plan, you'd have the CPC article for David Hedison's, you know, component of that site. So it would likely be a 2-article town meeting in terms of that site location.
Okay, thank you. All right. That brings us to the next item on our agenda, the discussion of future meetings, invitations for our proponents, and timeline for Finance Committee warrant book production. Well, the invitations are not there. We had proponents here this evening, unless we want to reach out to Deb DeVerna regarding her portion of the demolition delay. She's sure welcome to come to our next meeting if she wanted to elaborate further on it. But given the fact that we've been able to get through all the articles and ask questions this evening, I think we may be able to target actually reviewing, discussing, and voting next week. Does that work on everyone's schedule? I'm seeing nods. Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. And I'll reach out to John and check on that as well. So if we do that, as far as timeline is concerned, let me just. I don't seem to have. I know that.
We're about 4.5 weeks from town meeting right now, for the 18th of October. Yeah.
We had targeted voting no later than the September 30th meeting, which would be the last Thursday in September, in order to produce the letter by October 5th and get it over to the printer to bring a copy of the publication, at least by PDF, to be uploaded on the 6th or so, and then publication to be available in paper form the week prior to the town meeting. But if we're able to vote next week, I think that becomes much more manageable if we're not trying to cram it in between the 30th and that date. So we can target next week to review, discuss. Again, I'll reach out to Deb DeVerna, see if she wants to elaborate any further on that article and let her know that we will be voting on it that evening. I think we're in decent shape. All right. Is there any public comments? I see no press for press questions. And so I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion that we adjourn.
Second it.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night,
Good night.
everybody.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Good night, everybody.